never believed in ghosts. Working as a nurse at St. Vincent's Hospital for years, I'd seen all sorts of things. Patients surviving impossible odds, some passing away without any warning, but ghosts? That was just a myth. At least, that's what I told myself. It was a quiet night shift, the kind that makes you feel uneasy because things are too calm. The hospital was unusually empty, with only a few patients in the emergency ward and a couple in the ICU. I had just finished checking on a patient in room 203, an elderly woman recovering from a stroke, when I heard it for the first time. A whisper, faint, almost like the wind, but it had words, just barely audible. I froze in the hallway, my heart pounding. I glanced around, but no one was there. "Help me," the voice whispered again, softer this time. I tried to shake it off, as my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe I was just tired, I thought. After all, it was 2 a.m., and I hadn't slept well for days. I continued with my rounds, but the uneasiness stayed with me. As I made my way down the hallway, I passed room 207, a room that had been empty for weeks. The door was slightly ajar, though I was sure it had been closed earlier. I hesitated, feeling a chill run down my spine. Something was off. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was dark, and the air felt heavy. My fingers fumbled for the light switch, and when I flicked it on, the room was empty, just as it should be. But as I turned to leave, I saw it. On the bed, where no one had been just moments ago, was the faint outline of a body, like an impression left behind on the sheets. My breath caught in my throat, and I blinked, convinced it was just a trick of the light. But no matter how many times I blinked, this shape remained. I slowly backed out of the room, not daring to take my eyes off the bed until I was safely in the hallway. The door creaked as it shut behind me, and I tried to calm my racing heart. I needed to stay focused, stay logical. But logic was failing me. I decided to go back to the nurse's station. The head nurse, Janet, was there, going through some paperwork. I didn't want to sound crazy, so I tried to act normal. "Janet, did you hear anything strange tonight?" I asked, hoping she would say yes, that I wasn't the only one. She looked up at me, her brow furrowed. "Strange? Like what?" I hesitated. "Like whispers, or maybe something in the empty rooms?" Janet stared at me for a moment before shaking her head. "No, nothing. But this place can get creepy at night, can't it?" I forced a smile and nodded, but inside, I was still uneasy. I decided to focus on my duties, hoping to distract myself. But no matter what I did, the memory of that whisper and the shape on the bed kept creeping back into my mind. Around 3 a.m., I went to check on Mrs. Thompson in room 203 again. She had been stable all night, and I expected her to be asleep. But when I entered the room, she was wide awake, her eyes wide with fear. "Mrs. Thompson, are you okay?" I asked, rushing to her side. She grabbed my hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "The whispers," she said in a shaky voice. "They keep whispering to me, telling me to go with them." I felt a cold wave of fear wash over me. "What do you mean?" "Who's whispering to you?" She looked toward the corner of the room, her eyes wide with terror. "They're here. They want me to follow to them." I turned to look at the corner, but there was nothing there, just shadows cast by the dim light of the room. "There's no one here, Mrs. Thompson," I said softly, trying to reassure her. "You're safe." But her grip didn't loosen. "You don't understand," she whispered. "They won't leave me alone." I stayed with her until she eventually fell asleep, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. As I left her room, the hospital felt different. Darker, colder. Then the whisper came again. "Help me." This time it was clearer, and I could hear the desperation in the voice. It wasn't just in my head. It was real. I followed the sound down the hallway, past the ICU, and toward the older wing of the hospital, the one that had been closed off for renovations. The door to the old wing was slightly open, even though it was supposed to be locked. My hand trembled as I pushed it open wider and stepped inside. The air was stale, filled with dust and the faint scent of disinfectant. The lights flickered weakly, casting eerie shadows on the walls. "Help me," the voice came again, echoing down the empty hallway. I followed the sound, my heart pounding in my chest. The further I went, the darker it became, until I reached the very end of the hallway. There was a door there, slightly ajar, just like all the others. I took a deep breath and pushed it open. The room was cold, much colder than the rest of the hospital. In the center of the room was an old hospital bed, and on it lay a figure, a woman, pale and thin, with hollow eyes that stared at the ceiling. Her mouth moved, forming the words I had been hearing all night. "Help me." I stepped closer, my hands trembling. "Who are you?" I whispered, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. She slowly turned her head to look at me, her eyes filled with sorrow. "They left me here," she whispered. "They forgot about me." I felt a lump form in my throat. "Who forgot about you?" "The doctors, the nurses, everyone," she said, her voice barely audible. "I was here, waiting, but no one came." I looked around the room, noticing the old medical equipment, the dust-covered monitors, the abandoned IV stands. This room hadn't been used in years, maybe even decades. But this woman, this ghost, had been left behind. "What do you want me to do?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Remember me," she whispered, tears forming in her hollow eyes. "Don't let them forget me again," I nodded, tears filling my own eyes. "I won't forget you," I promised. The woman smiled faintly, and as she did, her body began to fade, slowly dissolving into the air. I watched in silence as she disappeared, leaving nothing behind but an empty bed and the lingering scent of antiseptic. I stood there for a long time, staring at the spot where she had been, before finally turning and leaving the room. The hospital was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet, peaceful, almost. As I made my way back to the nurse's station, I thought about the woman and the promise I had made. I didn't know who she was or how long she had been there, but I knew one thing for certain: I wouldn't let her be forgotten. From that night on, I made sure to check every room, even the ones that were supposed to be empty. I listened for the whispers, and I paid attention to the shadows. And whenever I walked down that old hallway, I would stop by that room at the end, just to make sure she was still at peace. I never heard the whispers again, but every now and then, when the hospital is quiet and the air feels heavy, I think of her. And I wonder how many others have been left behind, waiting for someone to remember them. When I first started working the night shift at Oakwood General Hospital, the other nurses warned me about room 109. They didn't say much, just whispered that it was trouble and that patients who stayed there often had strange experiences. Some had even requested to be moved, saying they felt like they weren't alone in the room. I dismissed it as hospital gossip, just stories to spook the new girl. The first time I had a patient assigned to room 109, I didn't think twice about it. Mr. Harris, a middle-aged man recovering from a heart attack, seemed like any other patient. When I checked on him during my rounds, he was resting comfortably, flipping through the TV channels with a bored expression. "How are you feeling tonight, Mr. Harris?" I asked as I entered the room, my voice cheerful to mask the exhaustion creeping up on me after hours of work. He looked up at me, his eyes hollow and tired. "I've been better," he said with a weak smile. "Can't sleep though. Too noisy." I frowned. "Noisy? What do you mean?" He gestured toward the wall behind his bed. "There's been knocking, like someone tapping on the wall. It's been going on all night." I glanced at the wall, my frown deepening. Room 109 was at the end of the hall, with no adjoining rooms on that side. There shouldn't be any noise. Maybe it was the pipes, I thought. Old hospitals always had quirks like that. "I'll check with maintenance," I said, trying to reassure him. "But try to get some rest, okay?" He nodded, but I could tell he wasn't convinced. As I left the room, I made a mental note to ask the night janitor about the pipes. The rest of my shift was uneventful, but when I passed by room 109 again later that night, I hesitated. Something about the room made me uneasy, a feeling I couldn't quite explain. The door was closed and the lights were off, but I thought I heard something, a faint tapping sound, just like Mr. Harris had described. I shook my head, trying to shake off the feeling. It was probably just my imagination running wild after hearing his complaints. Still, I couldn't help but feel a shiver run down my spine as I walked away. The next night, Mr. Harris seemed more agitated. When I entered his room, he was sitting up in bed, staring at the wall with a look of fear on his face. "They're back," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Who's back?" I asked, trying to keep my tone calm. "The people." I heard them again, talking, whispering. It's like they're right on the other side of the wall, but when I call out, no one answers. I felt a knot of unease in my stomach. "There's no one on the other side of that wall, Mr. Harris. It's just an empty corridor." He shook his head, his eyes wide with fear. "You don't understand. They're there. I can hear them. They keep saying my name." I didn't know what to say. He seemed so certain, so afraid. Part of me wanted to dismiss it as hallucinations or a side effect of his medication, but there was something about the way he spoke, the way his eyes darted around the room as if he was expecting something or someone to appear at any moment. "Do you want me to move you to another room?" I asked gently, hoping that might ease his mind. But he shook his head again, more forcefully this time. "No, they'll follow me. They're here for me." I didn't know how to respond to that. I tried to reassure him, to tell him that he was safe, but I could tell he didn't believe me. And to be honest, I wasn't sure I believed myself anymore. That night, after my shift ended, I couldn't stop thinking about room 109. I asked some of the other nurses if they had ever experienced anything strange there, but most of them just shrugged it off as coincidence or overactive imaginations. Only one nurse, a woman named Karen who had been working at the hospital for over 20 years, seemed to take it seriously. "There's something wrong with that room," she said quietly when we were alone in the break room. "I've seen too many patients lose their minds in there. They hear things, see things that aren't there. And it's always the same story. They feel like someone's watching them, whispering to them." I stared at her, my unease growing. "What do you think it is?" Karen shook her head. "I don't know. But whatever it is, it's not friendly. I always try to avoid going in there if I can help it." Her words stuck with me. And as the nights went by, I found myself dreading my rounds whenever I had to pass by room 109. Mr. Harris continued to deteriorate. His once calm demeanor was replaced by fear and paranoia. He started refusing his medication, convinced it was poisoned, and he wouldn't sleep, claiming that if he did, they would get him. One night, I found him standing by the window, his eyes wide with terror. When I asked him what was wrong, he turned to me, his voice trembling. "They're inside the room now," he whispered. "I can hear them. They're getting closer." I checked the room, of course, but there was nothing. No one. The only sound was the hum of the air conditioning and the distant beeping of monitors from down the hall. But I could see the fear in Mr. Harris's eyes, and it scared me. What if he wasn't imagining it? What if there really was something in that room? The next morning, Mr. Harris was gone. Not transferred, not discharged. Gone. His bed was empty, the sheets neatly tucked in as if no one had ever been there. There was no record of him leaving the hospital, no sign that he had checked out or been moved to another ward. It was as if he had simply vanished into thin air. The hospital staff was baffled. An investigation was launched, security footage was reviewed, but there was nothing. No one had entered or left room 109 during the night. Mr. Harris had just disappeared. I couldn't stop thinking about what he had said, that they were coming for him, that they were inside the room. Had they taken him? Had whatever haunted that room finally claimed him? I started avoiding room 109 after that. I would reroute my rounds to skip it entirely, and I never accepted patients assigned to it. But even when I wasn't near it, I could feel its presence, a dark shadow lurking at the edge of my mind. The rumors about room 109 continued, but I didn't need to hear them anymore. I knew the truth. There was something in that room, something that shouldn't be there, something that took people, and no one who went inside ever came back.